Hello, hello, hello. Konnichiwa, ciao, bonjour, salut, guten Tag to everyone, wherever you are and whatever language or languages you speak. My name is Daniel Erendus, and I'm the founder and curator of TEDxLambeth. For those of you who are joining us here for the first time, I'd like to say a couple of words as a way of introduction. TEDxLambeth is a non-profit event licensed under TED Talks. The idea behind TED and the TEDx platform is to give a platform for speakers to share ideas worth spreading. TED stands for Technology, Education and Design, but obviously the theme, the entirety of the topics that TED and TEDx events have so far looked at are varied, are broader than that. The difference between TED and TEDx is that TEDx events are independently organized by volunteers from within the community. TEDxLambeth is based in Lambeth, in London, but our speakers come from all sorts of backgrounds and from everywhere, and that reflects the diversity in Lambeth itself. Today, I've got a very special guest, Ben Brabyn, who was one of our speakers last year. Ben Brabyn is a former Royal Marines officer and also the former head of Level 39. He's now the campaign coordinator for Genie shares. He joined JP Morgan as an analyst. He worked in New York, London, and the Middle East before launching his first digital business in 2001. As the world's first crowdfunding business, Be My Charity enabled 800,000 donors to deliver more than £50 million to UK charities. Since February 2016, he's been an ambassador for the Royal Navy and Heropreneurs. And when he was on Level 39, he supported 200 high-growth technology companies who have been transforming the security, productivity, and reach of global financial services and other sectors. So, Ben, welcome. How are you?
Thank you. I'm very well. It's a pleasure to join you.
My pleasure as well, Ben. So, first of all, I'd like to ask, are you in quarantine? Please tell us a bit about your recent business activities.
Well, so I've been, I guess, one of the very fortunate people who's been relatively affected by this pandemic. I actually left Level 39 the week before lockdown. So, of course, in that tumultuous few weeks of March in London, I don't think anyone really noticed I'd left, and quite understandably, because there was a great deal, of course, affecting every one of those 200 companies that you mentioned. And so from my point of view, as someone who had left Level 39 at a time when everyone else was adapting to a huge changed working environment, it was really an opportunity for me to do two things. On the one hand, to essentially reevaluate what was going to be different in this extraordinary, rapid, evolving environment we're in, and to see where I could be most useful. Having been running, of course, a cluster in East London, which was then immediately dispersed, a lot of my work has involved bringing people together physically. But I've spent the last 2 years figuring ways of bringing people together without depending on a physical platform or location. So I've really accelerated that activity on the one hand, and I've also had the opportunity to spend more time with family, and I've very much enjoyed that.
Gosh, yes. I mean, it's been a very interesting period. I remember coming to your office a year ago to Level 39, and it was such a great place for people to share a room and sort of discuss ideas. It was very interesting. But now you've left, and you've got the new initiative, which we're going to come to in a second. So, Ben, do you think the effects of the pandemic will affect your routine when restrictions to the lockdown have been eased?
Well, I guess from a personal point of view, the change was already happening. But if it hadn't already happened, then it would happen as a result of COVID-19. In that I was leaving Level 39 before the lockdown, before this immense disruption. So personally, I was contemplating life without that daily commute across London into Canary Wharf, an amazing concentration, 120,000 people all brought together every day in that very dense environment. And of course, there are huge advantages to that in terms of clustering productivity. And there's reports by the Milken Institute, for example, indicating that that part of London is the most productive region in Europe, or at least has been. I expect that will be very substantially challenged and changed. I think there's opportunity as well as threat. For someone like me, I guess it's perhaps somewhat easier to adapt. I'm at a stage in my career where I've already built a great many relationships, which I can perhaps sustain more easily at a distance. I think it's much more challenging for people perhaps at the earlier stages of their careers who really need the opportunity to pick up the culture of their organization. And I don't think there's any real substitute for that, bringing people together in close proximity to achieve that kind of that kind of sense of inclusion within your organization.
Yes, I mean I agree with that, and lots of people have been affected, and lots of people are interested to know what's going to happen, after the pandemic is over. So, any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm conscious that one of the patterns of behaviour which many of us perhaps are demonstrating at the moment is a desire to confuse what we think will happen with what we want to happen. And I'm going to plead guilty to that. I do that. But I am conscious that if one does it consistently, thoughtfully, deliberately, then there's a reasonable chance in this crisis to bring about some better outcomes. So while, of course, being part of a cluster is a great privilege for the people who are in it, one of the drawbacks of it is that it does systematically increase inequality, because, of course, it's defined by who's excluded every bit as much as who's included. And so my work over the last 2.5 years, while being at the epicenter of a cluster in East London, in Canary Wharf, has been to try to figure how we can both enjoy those benefits, but at the same time extend them far beyond the physical boundaries of the cluster. So I think that the kind of thinking which has underpinned the project I've been involved with, Genie Shares, is actually likely to become more prevalent. Now, I will immediately say, I want that to be true, but I believe that it will be true, because I've noticed that right across our society, throughout politics and throughout community activities, there's been a real desire to acknowledge the fact that we've perhaps placed too little emphasis on the vital role played by people right across the country, spread out geographically, keeping our vital systems, our healthcare, our security, our logistics, our food supply functioning as it should. And I think this pandemic will offer us not an opportunity, but an obligation to acknowledge that and make sure that we have a more equitable society as a result.
I think shape up things to come, Ben.
We cannot assume it. We've got to make our efforts directed in that direction.
Yeah. You mentioned Genie Shares. Would you mind going into that a bit? So you mentioned that it's the sort of thing that people need nowadays. In what ways would you say?
Well, briefly by way of background, Genie Shares is a campaign which I initiated now 2.5 years ago, but which has really picked up speed under COVID-19. And it's a very simple mechanism by which entrepreneurs give 1% of the equity of their business away. They give it away to an individual, and they do so in a way which doesn't just affect that individual, but which is demonstrable and highly visible to others. In other words, what they do is they stop talking about the technical value of their business or the economic value of their business. Instead, they focus on their motivation, their purpose. And for example, in the case of, in fact, the example which I used in the TEDx talk that I gave last year, Peter Kelly, an entrepreneur in Plymouth, gave equity in his business Employable away to a lady called Jodie, who was signing on in a job centre where Peter himself used to sign on. His business helps people into employment, and it's a very impressive business. But what really struck a chord with many people was that here was a business person who was both ambitious and driven and highly capable, but also humble and engaged with his community. And when he and Jodie met as peers and he gave her that 1% equity, it impressed and inspired not only his colleagues, but also his customers. Sales more than tripled in part as a result of that act. I mean, it's a very impressive business in other ways too. but it was a fantastic business development tool, which at the same time sent a very powerful signal about his commitment to his community in Plymouth and beyond. And I think that that kind of activity is more appreciated now than ever before. So we've seen millions of pounds worth of equity now pledged through Genie shares to support key workers, volunteers, carers, and other people who are doing unsung things, perhaps, to bring our community together.
Yes, I mean, Genie Shares is available on all social media outlets, genieshares.com, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn as well. So it's very interesting. It's an interesting idea. I wonder what motivated you. Where did you get that idea?
Well, I suppose the problem I observed was that over the last 3 or 4 years, technology businesses have really done the almost incredible in challenging financial services for kind of loss of public esteem. Of course, the charge sheet is growing and growing. It includes fake news, embedded bias, threats to jobs, driving increased inequality. All of this, of course, against a backdrop of growing populism. And if Thomas Piketty is right, real incomes for the bottom 50% of the population, not just in the UK, but across the developed world, have been stagnant for a generation. They've been flat since the millennium, which means half the population is really seeing no improvements to their lives that they can attribute to business and technology. And so we shouldn't be surprised if people vote for anti-business policies, if people believe that they've heard it all before and they're no longer interested. So rather than presenting arguments about business or technology, it seems far more powerful to present arguments about mutuality, and rather than arguments, really, making it more entertaining first, inviting people to be interested rather than expecting them to listen to your monologue about the value of what you do. And the inspiration for achieving that actually comes from a campaign which is 80 years old nearly now. The creation of a fund after the Second World War in the United Kingdom, locally called premium bonds, but more widely known as prize-linked savings, in which the national debt was refinanced by a nationwide savings scheme in which, rather than receiving a predictable interest rate, savers had a prize pot allocated stochastically, distributed in a way which is unpredictable. And that had two important effects. It lowered the cost of capital for the government, because the prize fund required to achieve a certain level of savings was smaller than the equivalent interest pot. But more importantly, perhaps, increased the demographic breadth of participation. In other words, people who would never normally save did, because even 5 shillings back then had the chance of winning a very life-changing amount of money. So people who would normally have put their savings under their bed were motivated to participate in this national reconstruction scheme. Here, in other words, was something that 90% of the population could agree on. And at a time when so many of our populations divide pretty much down the middle on key issues, it seemed to me a really attractive prize to find something that most of us could believe in, something that would bring together the dynamism and energy of entrepreneurs with the social license to operate upon which business depends.
Gosh, yes. I mean, we've always got to remember the historical aspect of business and how different forces affect, the numbers, basically, the quantities that affect finance. So it's always very interesting to look at the history of our economy and see what things we can improve on and what ideas can improve our lives. I think that leads me to another question about recessions. Some people have been worried about a recession, depression, or even a more serious global financial crisis. Do you think we're on the verge of these problems?
Well, I wouldn't present myself as a particularly expert economist, but I'm certainly very concerned that I think in our desire to see a return to the familiar, we perhaps are inclined to see things like relaxation of lockdown conditions in many countries as a sign of a return to normal. I don't think it is. I think that we are nearer to the beginning than the end of this crisis, if not in healthcare terms, then certainly in economic terms. And I think that not only that, but the consequences will be exacerbating inequality. They will continue to punish the vulnerable more than they punish the already relatively secure. So increasing gaps are likely to open up in our communities and between our societies as well. And I think that we should all exercise ourselves to make sure that we are doing what we can to feed cohesion domestically and to feed cohesion internationally. And that's not only an economic challenge, I think it's very much a political challenge too.
Yes. In some ways, a brave new world.
Well, yes. After the tempest has passed, let's hope it's more of a Shakespearean Brave New World than a Huxley one.
Gosh. I was actually going to mention to our audiences, if you've got any questions, so we're going to spend the first 40 minutes of this conversation. So I'll be asking the questions, like we've done so far. The last 20 minutes, we're going to open the floor for any questions from our audiences. So if you have any questions, please send us comments either on YouTube or send us a message on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, or email us. Our email is info@TEDxLambeth.com. Right. So I was going to ask about. So again, go back to the pandemic, the current crisis. Many people have been critical over our lack of preparedness for a crisis such as this. Do you have any opinions on this issue?
Well, I've had a huge privilege in the last few years of working in the private sector between large and small organizations. So small fintech and cybersecurity companies seeking to engage with global, complex financial services organizations, but also with government, various departments of government. In fact, I think I totted it up and I had dealings with 14 different departments of the UK central government. And of course, plenty of encounters with local governments and indeed some overseas governments as well. So it was a very privileged environment in which to see government working to support and engage with the public sector and with other governments and actually with academia. And I have to say, I found myself very impressed almost all of the time. Immense complexity and a great many competing priorities and interests, dealt with not always as fast as the more agile organizations, particularly smaller ones in the private sector, can achieve, but with a rigor which really inspired and impressed me. So I am slow to criticize. I do think, though, that it's important that we learn lessons from what has happened. And one of the characteristics of the current situation is just the poverty of data. There's still a great deal we don't know about this pandemic. There's a great deal we don't know about the acquisition of immunity, for example. And comparing headline numbers can sometimes be misleading. If you don't have the same denominator, for example, you shouldn't be surprised if the numerator is different. And so we're in danger of drawing quite a lot of compelling and dramatic conclusions based on relatively flimsy data and evidence. I do think that we should scrutinize this, and I do think we should seek to learn. But I think at all times and throughout this, something which is very, very important is that we maintain a great deal of sympathy for the motivations and intent of people, both in government and outside government. There are people who are taking advantage of and abusing others in this environment, and we should prevent that from happening to the greatest extent possible. But we really need a reservoir of goodwill. We need to acknowledge the difficulty which others face and the fact that much of that is unknowable to us. And maintaining that sympathy and communal trust, I think, is going to be important now and increasingly important as the tensions build. And I believe that they will build. As the healthcare situation perhaps comes under more control, the challenges of maintaining social order while encouraging economic recovery will bring real stresses to our communities. And we must be sympathetic to each other, to our governments, to our companies and employees and employers. And we must, of course, also be sympathetic to our neighbours at every stage.
Food for thought. Very, very interesting, Ben. How about the the employees. What about people who already feel economically helpless? What would be a recommendation for them?
Well, speaking as someone who's currently unemployed, I think that if you're an employee, whether you're on furlough or not now, of course, you're actually in a relatively privileged position. And I think that while it's very important that the contract, the broad social contract between employers and employees is cherished and nurtured, we're moving, and we have been for some time, and perhaps COVID has simply accelerated this, to an increasingly gig-like economy. And so I think it's enormously important that corporations of every size consider the people outside their payroll as well as the people on their payroll. And that's really what Genie Shares has gone some way to address. Of course, for many years, some companies have sought to increase ownership among their employees. They've paid in stock, equity, as well as in salary, cash. And I think that's to be encouraged, but I think it's to be extended too. And I think the most compelling response to the first Genie Shares project, which we did and which I talked about in the TEDx talk, was the sense of ownership which Jodie felt when she received equity in Employable. It wasn't the economic value. It was the sense of having a stake in growth, in success, a stake in hope. And I think that for those people who are in vulnerable gig employee roles, who are not necessarily on a formal payroll, it's very important that collectively we value what they do. Many of them are key workers. Many of them are in industries upon which we depend, in logistics, for example, and in providing support to the healthcare service. So we must be very careful to make sure that we don't simply leave all of our support to people who are already in the relatively privileged position of being on a payroll. We must extend the reach throughout the economy.
Gosh, yes. Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to give some our audiences things to think about. I mean, that's very enlightening. So thank you, Ben. You also mentioned your talk last year. I'd actually like to go back to that talk. You mentioned about a trickle-down effect right at the start, and I think lots of people, the failure of the trickle-down effect and how we could sort of perhaps work around that. I was just wondering if you could say a couple of words about the failure of the trickle-down effect and what we can do.
Well, of course, the idea that that value trickles down through the economy has gained a lot of currency since perhaps the 1980s, and has dominated policy making, certainly across the West. But I think, and again, I'm going to refer to Thomas Piketty and his work, Capital in the 21st Century. It simply stopped working. And even after tax redistributions, the concentration of wealth at the very top and the reduction of the proportion going to the bottom 50% of the population. And this is, again, true not just in the Anglo-Saxon economies, but right across the G7, is consistent and compelling. And speaking as somebody who grew up thinking that technology broadly brought not only progress, but increased equality, both of opportunity and outcome, I've been very shocked to find that the technologies which, of course, communities like Level 39 do so much to bring to market, which create huge value, don't distribute that value in a way which is necessarily conducive to public support. So when you're surrounded by people from 50 different countries, 200 companies, 1,250 people, pushing at the boundaries of innovation, brilliance brought together. It's very, very exciting environment to be in. But the gusher of hope and value, and I think it's worth this little thought experiment. Try in the sentences where you use one or the other, exchanging the words hope and equity. You find that they often can pretty much substitute exactly for each other. Huge amounts of equity value, huge amounts of hope being created in clusters like Level 39, but not then distributed very far at all. And the barriers to entry get higher and higher. The skills required to participate become more and more exclusive. So fewer and fewer people really get to experience this. Now we can change that, not only by providing more education and opportunity, but actually by recognizing that some people will neither want or perhaps be able to make that fortunate journey, on that narrow path to successful entrepreneurship. But we should still seek to give them some sense of stake, some sense of ownership. And while doing that on a national scale really requires policy, those of us who are private citizens, those of us who are entrepreneurs, can play a small part in signaling it, prompting it. And that's what Genie Shares is about. It's about recognizing that it's based on research done by Peter Tofano, the Dean of Side Business School, on how the savings scheme that I mentioned earlier, premium bonds, can stimulate a change of behavior far beyond just the population of people who actually receive the prizes. So the premium bond scheme encouraged a nation to save. Genie Shares is intended to encourage a nation to hope and believe in the value of business and technology, even though the actual proportion of people participating may still remain small.
Very interesting. Ben, what is your view on Brexit?
Well, that's a question I haven't been asked for a little while. It's been one of the casualties, perhaps, of so much of the focus on the pandemic. I think it's very hard to unpick these issues. And indeed, I'm not sure that it's politically helpful to do so for a non-politician like me. It seems to me that there is a conspiracy of factors, an accumulation of circumstances which conspire to make the economic challenges that we face in this country, but in others too, very, very dramatic. So I don't envy the negotiators responsible for the Brexit negotiation. I think, however, that what they're doing is itself a subset of a huge challenge that we face in making sure that our society is not only sustainable, but equitable. And so I'm conscious that it's a complex, difficult issue that they must deal with. It may take more time than is currently allocated to it, but I think it's only a subset of a much more fundamental challenge that we face. So whether you're a Brexiteer or a Remainer, I'd invite you to consider that the most pressing challenge is for us to rebuild our economy in a way which enjoys the support and consent of a proper majority.
Yes. I mean, you actually mentioned that you that question wasn't asked of you for a long time, and I thought that was an interesting comment, because the current crisis has been sort of overshadowed everything that's happened before that. Do you think Brexit is still relevant, or can we compare? How can we compare it with the current, the effect of the current pandemic on the UK economy?
Well, of course, Brexit is still relevant. Our relationship with trading partners around the world is enormously relevant. I think the two, however, and when I use the word conspire, I didn't mean it in a pejorative sense. Converge would perhaps be better. But between them, they both, I think, reflect the challenges of operating in an increasingly fragmented world, politically speaking. And the fragmentation is true of major alliances between countries, but I think it's true of the social contracts within countries as well. Populism has accelerated across much of the Western world, certainly. And I think that reflects a reduction in mutual trust, in what sometimes people call social capital. And certainly my motivation in Genie Shares is that I'm excited by something which can help bring people together to recover from crisis, whether that crisis was, for a couple of generations ago, a world war, or for us, the combination of pandemic, of growing inequality, of decoupling of economies, of the fracture between the employer and the employee as we move towards more informal work in which the returns to capital continue to outstrip the returns to labor.
Yes, I mean, lots of people, I think, would have to sort of think about the consequences of what's been going on. I'm not an expert, so it's sort of very difficult to comment. But one of the things I was interested to know was whether international, whether business, international businesses have a moral obligation to to help, you know, the people, the communities that are in need, as you mentioned. So with Genie Shares, it's sort of UK based, but what's the extent to which international business can contribute to this, you know, initiative?
Well, the challenge to which Genie Shares seeks to respond is not a unique problem in the UK, United Kingdom. So I would very much like to see Genie Shares or something like it take off in other parts of the world as well. And indeed, we're already having a number of conversations. We're very fortunate to have the support of Salesforce, which of course is a very global firm indeed. And so I am certainly looking for ways in which we can extend this reach. I've had a number of conversations in Asia, Africa, and North America. But they are just at this stage conversations. I'm very keen that we develop the formula in the UK to the extent we can. There's plenty to do here. And there's, I think, a broad political appetite for it as well. Having had conversations right across the political spectrum, what is very stark and apparent is that wherever you are, left and right, if you can see a way of harnessing ambition and the purpose and drive of entrepreneurship with something which embeds that into communities and expresses the mutuality of benefit of business, well, that's a kind of magic formula which it seems I've yet to find many people to disagree with. The role of big business in supporting that, of course, well, that's of course a question in part for the discussion between management, employees, and shareholders. But I'd suggest that, you know, pretty much every aspect of sustainability now involves understanding the context, the social context, not only the environmental context, but the social context of big business. And if as a big business, and Salesforce is a fantastic example, already through their 1-1-1 commitment, commit 1% of much of what they do to support causes outside their perimeter, not employees, not customers, but their communities. Well, the call to action for big corporates is why not help every other company in your ecosystem, in your supply chain, among your distributors, to build those kinds of entanglements with communities. So even as a big corporate, you don't want to become a Genie Shares pledger yourself. Consider inviting all of your downstream distributors, your own customers, to do so and help them tell their stories. Make short films, as we did with Peter Kelly and Employable, demonstrating just what an important part businesses play in their communities.
Yeah. And what about a movement, a shift towards the east, because lots of people think that sort of economic power is shifting towards the east, towards you know, China, Japan, Taiwan. What is your view on that, and how can, you know, how does that affect businesses here in the UK?
Well, I think that's I think the evidence is fairly compelling that particularly the rise of China as an economic power is beyond doubt. I wouldn't go so far, for example, as to say that the formula we've developed with Genie Shares will necessarily fit in every cultural context. So I wouldn't take this opportunity to suggest that there is one particular response which I would advocate for everybody. But your question is much broader than whether Genie Shares, for example, might fit everywhere. And I don't know that I could, I feel underqualified to answer such an enormous question. I think that the challenges of a multipolar world will keep us all on our toes for some time to come, and understanding how business can operate when the political context is under quite significant stress and strain, when trade war seems to be becoming a more familiar expression. It's going to keep big and small businesses very preoccupied against what is already a challenging backdrop for recovery.
Gosh, another food for thought. I especially like the word you use, multipolar economy. It's very sort of relevant. We've got 5 minutes until we open the floor for our audiences to ask questions. Before that, I wanted to ask one of my own questions, personal questions. I actually came across you, Ben, about 10 years ago, when I was hoping to join the Royal Marines. I found your documentary, the BBC documentary that you did when you were doing the interviews for the Royal Marines, and it was very inspirational. So you've actually been a very inspirational figure, in my, in my aspiration to join, in my ambitions, basically. Which is one of the reasons why I approached you to give a talk at TEDx. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about your experience within the Royal Marines. I know it's been a long time that you've been in the Royal Marines, and what lessons have you learned that are relevant for what you do now?
Well, you have a very long memory, and of course, your ability to recognize me. I was a lot younger. I had a lot more hair up here. I left the Marines 20 years ago. I served for 5 years. And of course, that was a very different era. 1995 to 2000 predates a huge amount of political change and a huge amount of military activity. So I guess some things remain the same. It's a huge privilege to be part of an organization that is as rigorous in its selection, as thorough in its training, as committed in its purpose as the Royal Marines. And for me, it was both a source of friendships for life and also the opportunity to test out how teams could operate and how I could operate in teams, to figure out what I was good at and what I was not so good at, and to embed, I hope, some values and techniques which have served me very well. So while my own military experience was a very long time ago, I've had the huge privilege, really ever since, of being, I suppose, one of the characters who people in the military, certainly the Royal Marines, quite often come to as they are essentially considering a transition to civilian life. And so I've seen a steady stream of people, many of them absolutely tested to the limits in the most intense military conflicts of the last 20 years, bringing their incredible determination, their unflappability, their unselfishness to a wide variety of different public and private institutions. And so for me, it's been a huge privilege to essentially play a small part in helping some of those people find the most productive life beyond military service. So I would encourage everybody to consider employing, investing in, working for, or in any other way collaborating with military veterans. It's a group of people who have often, to the surprise of many, I think, learned humility the hard way. And in fact, I think if you watch the short film we made of Peter Kelly, and that's in both the TEDx talk and available on YouTube and at genieshares.com, you'll see somebody who is both driven and determined, and also incredibly humble and charismatic. And he is, I wouldn't say he's typical of anything. He's a truly exceptional man. You'll find many others who have served who have a similar combination of determination and public service, which I think is of great importance at any time, but never more than now, as we are challenged on our cohesion. So I think veterans have an exceptional part to play, not now only as serving military people, but as stalwarts of a community under stress, people who bring together, who calm, who reassure, and who lead. So I'm very, very proud to have spent a short time, an early part of my career as a Royal Marine, and delighted to see so many veterans now playing a much wider part in the community in every walk of life too.
Gosh, thank you, Ben. Right, so let's open the floor for questions from our audiences. We've got a couple of questions. I can see one from Sally Brown. She's asking if you have any tips for aspiring entrepreneurs. So what tips would you give for aspiring entrepreneurs?
Well, thank you, Sally. That's a fantastic question. And I guess I have two tips. I've got loads of tips, but let me just start with two. The first one is find a problem that matters to people who are prepared to act upon it and have the resources to do so. Very often, I think entrepreneurs solve a problem which is immediately apparent to them and which may preoccupy them, but doesn't necessarily have a natural set of clients. Sometimes people talk about building a better mousetrap. Build it and they will come. Well, it's worth checking that they will come. It's worth checking that they exist and that they can afford what it is you're planning to do. There's an awful lot of solutions to problems that no one cares about or can afford to pay for. So I guess what I mean, therefore, is go find your customers first and then figure out what your solution to that problem should be. And the second thing, and this is a bit counterintuitive for many, is that a lot of entrepreneurs just talk obsessively about their product. And that will interest people who are already interested in that particular product and the issue it might address. The biggest challenge most companies face is that no one knows who they are. So I would invite everybody to consider how you can broaden your network as much as possible. And here's the key hack to this. You don't have to keep telling people all about your product. And so, for example, in level 39, a simple rule of thumb I noticed was the best predictive indicator of success for entrepreneurs was when I noticed they were starting to come up in other people's conversations. Now, the reason for this is actually pretty simple when you think it through. If other people are talking about you, it doesn't really matter whether they've got any knowledge about your product or service, but they are raising awareness of you. And awareness of you generally is much more important and much more persistent than the precise knowledge of your product by the prospective customer at the time they have time and budget to make a decision. So it's far more important to raise awareness generally than it is to tell everybody about the details of your product or service.
Gosh, yes, thank you. More things to examine and explore for our audiences. Another question is from Rev Parry. He's first of all, he's sending his regards and asking asking about your view on homeless veterans. So that's again, I suppose that's a military question in a way, and how businesses can help.
Well, thank you. I guess, of course, not every military veteran has the same experience. And it's absolutely right to highlight the fact that many struggle with particularly mental illness after their service, during and after their service. And while military charities and increasingly, I think also it's fair to acknowledge the government are trying to organize a response to this, it seems inevitable that some people fall between the cracks in support. And so I have just celebrated the amazing value which veterans can bring to organizations. But yes, thank you for the reminder really to us all that for those who are not able to join the workforce, life after service can be very bleak and very challenging, very lonely, and veteran homelessness and veteran suicide are both a stain really. I think as a community, I've been talking quite a bit about our need to be cohesive, to embrace and support our neighbors, those who are different from us, not simply by saying, here is some help to become more like me, which is often underlying of some educational programs, for example, but to respect and acknowledge difference and support people who may have very different needs from ourselves. For those veterans who do struggle with homelessness, with mental illness, I think it's not enough simply to say that's a government responsibility or that's a corporate responsibility, or indeed that's a responsibility for others in the veteran community. It's something for us all. And I don't have, I'm sorry to say, a very good answer. But just as we help and celebrate the most successful, the most inspiring, I think we all have something of a duty to try to help those who are less visible. And I guess that's a challenge for each of us to try and figure our part to play in individually. I don't have a policy prescription, I'm afraid. I don't feel I know enough, but I would implore everybody to consider what they individually can do.
Thank you, Ben. We've got another question from Akbar Akhtar. And he's asking about your the charity work that you did, Be My Charity, and if you could tell us a bit about Be My Charity as a project that you did, because I think they saw the 40 million, was that the figure? And I think that might be an interesting.
Well, that was a very long time ago as well. So after I left the Royal Marines, I briefly became an investment banker with JP Morgan. And while I was with them, I had a ringside seat as the dot-com bubble burst. And at the time, there was an expression called B2B, not business to business, but back to banking, and B2C, back to consulting, as people who had spent the late 1990s leaving their consulting and banking careers to set up dot-coms came back. I went in the other direction, and with a brilliant friend called Matt Cooper, a kind of polymath, brilliant man, set up Be My Charity. And our aim was very simple. We knew that the fastest growing segment of charity incomes in the UK in the 1990s was through sponsored events. And we believed we could digitize that. We thought this was something which didn't have the product delivery problem facing and indeed ruining many dot-com ventures at the time. It was something which could be done entirely digitally. And so we integrated a payment system, and we created what I suppose now you could call a rudimentary social network. We didn't see its potential in the way that some others did, but we certainly found ourselves exploring a trove of data as we understood the dynamics of giving. And that took us into some very interesting territory and conversations. The business was a fairly straightforward one, really. It involved people setting up profile pages, explaining why they were running a marathon, say, for a good cause, and inviting others to make sponsorship payments to help them hit their target total, which might have been £1,500 or more, depending on what they were doing. And of course, messages were exchanged. So it had rudimentary social network characteristics. And of course, we took all of the financial information and reported that to the charities, and massively increased the capture of gift aid, which is a tax rebate system in the UK. So over the course of those 10 years and subsequently when we sold the business, I think the business overall raised over £50 million for good causes. But it did so in a way which was much more efficient than the old, more paper-based way too. So I'd like to think that's now become pretty much a staple model for charitable fundraising, and in fact, not just in the UK.
Very, very interesting. Ben, we've got another question by Kevin Topani. And he's asking about whether we should become more like America. What's your view on that? Yeah.
Goodness, Kevin, I don't know where to begin. I think we can learn quite a lot from America. I assume you mean the United States of America. And perhaps they can learn a little from us too. But I can't see any way of answering your question without causing huge offense to somebody. And so since I still aspire to some diplomatic possibilities, let me think. Well, we can certainly learn, can't we, about how to support dynamic innovation. But I think, to me, and I think Daniele brought us together for TEDxLambeth to discuss antinomies and managing, reconciling the desire to be both hard-charging, ambitious, highly individualistic, determined, purposeful, with being community-spirited, with supporting the vulnerable, with creating some equality. That's a real reconciliation challenge. And certainly that, of course, is, well, something I think which I experienced in the Royal Marines, which encourages both personal discipline and determination, and also unselfishness and cheerfulness in adversity. It's reconciliation that I think is the greatest prize, rather than picking a simple extreme. Very often when we talk about people and businesses, we look for superlatives. We define them on single axes. But in the people who we love, we rarely define them by their superlatives. We're really interested in the blend that they achieve. And so it seems to me that rather than seeking superlatives to attach ourselves to, it's far better to become good at compromise, good at reconciliation.
Gosh, yes. I must say that is a broad question, but we welcome both broad questions and detailed, specific questions. So it's always good to to explore those ideas. Another question is from Paul Fallon, and he's asking about further links with the Middle East. Business for further business links with the Middle East, and whether you've got any opinions on that. Should we explore that idea? I suppose. Yeah.
Well, Paul, that's another huge question. It seems to me that we should be seeking to make productive relationships wherever we can. It seems there's an old expression, I think, jaw is better than war. It's better to engage and to talk than it is to posture at a distance. And where there is disagreement, it seems better to discuss than to simply deny. It strikes me as there's a huge amount of innovation being done at the moment in Islamic finance, for example, opening the prospects of more exchange, more engagement between the Middle East and other parts of the world. More integration of economies. And that's particularly important, I think, I have spent a little bit of time around the Middle East, and clearly the challenges there of a largely resource-based group of economies that have relatively few employment opportunities for broad swathes of their population are almost an extreme expression, almost an advanced warning, perhaps, of the direction of travel of more Western economies, where the hollowing of the middle as more and more skilled jobs are challenged by technology advances. We face a shared challenge in that, and we should look for ways to share the solutions to that challenge too. And in fact, part of the reason why Genie Shares is called Genie Shares is because a genie who brings magic and surprise, not always positive surprises in Islamic tradition, is a good example, I'd like to think, of a relatively rare cultural symbol that's beloved across cultures, West and East. We all need good fortune. We all need opportunity. And indeed, Islam, with my very, very limited understanding, deeply acknowledges the importance of mutuality. And of course, there is a long tradition of zakat, which has modestly influenced some of the people who've contributed to Genie Shares. So I very much hope for closer relationships.
Wow. I hadn't made that connection between Genie and the Islamic, the Middle Eastern stories. And that also reminded me of your the title of your TEDxLambeth talk, which was Ambition and Humility, which was a very interesting combination because it not only addressed our theme, Antinomies, but it's wide enough to allow people to look beyond opposites and see what lies higher than our problems. Another question, we've got 5 more minutes, is by Irini Kutumanu. And she's asking about your relationship with Russia. Our relationship with Russia, has it become unarguably good? That's a difficult one as well, I think.
Has it become unarguably good?
Yeah.
Goodness, these are challenging questions. Well, I've never been to Russia, but I have many Russian friends. And I therefore hesitate because I have had glimpses of the culture, but not really witnessed it firsthand. I have been amazed by how much we have in common, and horrified at the number of things that divide us. And the number of things that divide us doesn't seem to have diminished more recently. I hope that that will improve. I don't know enough to know what is required for it to do so. But just as I think that we should not leave all aspects of economic recovery to governments, just as I think it falls to us as individual citizens and individual businesses, large and small, to show our own initiative in achieving social cohesion. And that's what Genie Shares is. It is a private volunteer initiative. It is not mandated by the state, although certainly I'm having interesting conversations with some bits of government about it. It is a private thing that we as individuals can choose to do to show our mutuality, our solidarity with our fellow citizens in just the same way, regardless of what goes on state to state. I think the strongest response of us as individuals is to build relationships person to person. So to the greatest extent possible, whether it's with the people of the United States or people in the Middle East or people in Russia or people in other parts of the world, my view is get to know as many people as you can, bring humanity and specificity to those relationships. Because while that won't solve the political conflicts and challenges, it will at least mean we have a little more humanity and humility in our relationships. And that's a precursor, at least, to better understanding and perhaps to more political sympathy too.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben. I think that is drawing our conversation to an end. But as a final question, then, what is next? What is next for you as an entrepreneur?
And what's next for me? Well, actually, if you'd asked what's next generally, I think my answer would be the same. I don't know the answer, what's next broadly, or yet what's next for me. Of course, this combination of a pandemic and huge challenges to the economy create problems, but they also create opportunities. And I have the rather privileged position of not now managing an organization through that transition, which means I'm exploring where I can go next to be most useful. And Genie Shares at the moment is playing an important part in that. It's bringing me into fantastic conversations, not only with our friends at Salesforce, who've been doing a great deal to help, but with a great many other organizations, large and small as well. And as I said, we have now millions of pounds worth of equity pledged to be distributed. And so I have a huge invitation to anyone listening now to become involved. Get in touch with me through genieshares.com or at GenieShares on Twitter or GenieShares on LinkedIn or GenieShares on Instagram or GenieShares on Facebook, wherever suits you, and indeed YouTube. And please spread the word. And I am very keen to do everything I can to make that movement take off. From a personal point of view, I am dedicated to that, but I'm also available for other things. And of course, having spent several years drawing an ecosystem of fintech and cybersecurity companies together, I'm fascinated by ecosystem dynamics, but I'm particularly fascinated by cybersecurity. I think protecting the foundations, the bedrock of an economy is a precursor, a necessary requirement to economic recovery. And as we're all distributed to a greater extent than ever before, the threats, the vulnerabilities are more exposed. So many of the conversations I'm having now are about cybersecurity. But I am in the very fortunate position of having a little time to look around. So please get in touch about Genie Shares, and if I can help in any other way, I'm full of energy and full of curiosity and keen to help where I can.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ben. That was a wonderful conversation. I'm looking forward to more with you. I also like to thank the wonderful team behind TEDxLambeth Conversation Series. These series, they're doing a wonderful job of sending me questions that our audiences have sent to us. They're coordinating these things. So thank you, big thank you, and shout out for my team. Ben, a great pleasure once again, and we're looking for more with you very soon. So thank you
Daniel, thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.